And I think, like for me, this quote is very important because, very often we dismiss many of these things that we're talking about as not being political in a way. That we're talking about fans, and fans are just like a crazy bunch of people who are non-serious about life, and that talking about this is a non-serious issue. But in a sense, I think what when we talk about queerness, what we're really saying is, can we understand politics itself differently? Can we start developing new political languages? Can we start understanding how people think and form into groups and even vote in a different way than we've traditionally been doing? So in a way, we are talking about, we hope that at the end of this conversation, some of the things that we are talking about vis-a-vis fandom also become metaphorical ways of understanding the way that people identify in the world, and that the way that actually people come together as a group and an identity in the world.
And that begins from how people see the world, even if sometimes in fact, fandom opens up that people don't always see the world in respectable ways. And I think we've seen that throughout the different films, that we have fans that are full of excess. And actually, when we talk about obsession, is the word that it's come up in our conversations. Actually, the dictionary defines obsession as to be preoccupied or have your mind full of someone or something continually, intrusively, and to a troubling extent. So you can see that the dictionary definition of obsession, we already associate it with something negative, okay? So when we talk about and I think that's an important part of thinking about non-normative forms of love, okay? So we've said this, and Paromita has written about this, but when we were allowed to enjoy things to a certain extent, but if we enjoy things too much, that often is seen as inappropriate. So we can all say, oh, we enjoy watching films, but when we see some of the fan activity in the films, we say, oh, but they take it to an extreme, they're obsessed. Or, and you know this, you can post a picture on Instagram of some food you've eaten, and everyone says, oh, great shot, that looks delicious. But if you post a picture of yourself sitting on the couch eating a big bag of chips, people will say, oh, maybe she shouldn't have posted that. So the idea is that we have implicit ideas of what counts as love and enjoyment, but there's always an implicit limit of what's enjoying too much or going over the edge and being obsessed with something, and almost like as if that thing controls you. And I think that's important to talk about when we talk about fandom, and it relates to the queerness, because I'm saying that basically when you go close to that line of from liking something to liking something too much, you're questioning our rules that govern our behavior, and those rules are often associated with normativity.
So I want to tell a story about obsessive and unrespectable things, right? How many people used to, and obviously this is addressed to people under 35, but how many people used to read Mills and Boons when they were young? Or, I mean, there must be some equivalent of that later, right? Like romance novels, watching a lot of rom-coms. So I was a very bookish girl. I started reading very early. I was very serious, I got glasses when I was 9 years old, and everybody in my family started crying like, oh no, what's going to happen? Yeah, so we saw what happened. All the wrong things. But the thing is that, so I was not the type of girl who thought I would read romance novels. I kind of looked down on that sort of thing when I was, say, 10. But then when I was 13, possibly due to some hormonal changes, I began reading Mills and Boons. I mean, I read my first Mills and Boon by chance. I still remember it was called Pineapple Girl, and it was by Betty Niels. And then from the library, I began to borrow 3, 4 a day. I began to read them obsessively, right? And my mother began to say, this is very bad, you're reading too many Mills and Boons. So we all know, we've all heard our parents tell us we are reading too many something or the other. Too many comics, watching too much Netflix. There's always, you're supposed to control all these appetites, right? Now, many years later, I met a respectable political feminist type of person who said to me that, my mother used to always say that you shouldn't read so many Mills and Boons. They'll ruin your mind. And I said, they do ruin your mind in the best possible way, right? Because actually, what did the Mills and Boon offer? It offered endless possibility of fantasy. You're continuously in this fantasy world, but once you're in a fantasy world, you don't think that the real world is that interesting. And you start imagining a whole other life, not the life that's in the Mills and Boon, actually. But the capacity for fantasy is strengthened so much that you start thinking, I don't actually have to do what people say I have to do. Maybe I can have a completely different life than the one that we are supposed to lead. So actually, I think listening to music all the time, And all of these things, these sensory activities are erotic activities which make us think, I don't have to be the way people tell me. And that is also why people fear it and try to prevent you from doing it, right? Yeah. I mean, I would just say that even if the men in Mills and Boons don't exist, what's so amazing about men in real life that we had to choose that life, right? We didn't have to.
And the same can be said for Bollywood, right? I mean, that the fantasy, and so again, we all know it's fantasy, we all enjoy it, but we think that we need to enjoy it from a certain kind of distance. And I think what we're seeing in this film and in all of the films we've seen so far is that fandom means putting yourself on the line, right? It means actually not saying I'm going to see it from a distance. It actually means feeling like you're a part of it and feeling like the thing that's happening around you. We talked about collectivities, but communities are formed when something bigger, when you're part of something bigger than you, a fan group bigger than you.
That's why I wanted to show this, this picture of Radha and Krishna. Can anybody tell me what is unusual about it? They, they swapped their clothes. They're dressed in each other's clothes, right? And, and I think this is such an interesting way for us to think about fandom. If you saw Being Baijan earlier today, and you see how fans often model themselves as the object of their desire and fandom, and you often have songs which say कि मैं तुम्हारे रंग में रंग जाऊंगी, right, etc. And but actually you see that दोनों एक दूसरे के रंग में रंग गए हैं ना. It's like you become the person you desire for a while. There's a playfulness in it. There are so many Hindi film songs also in which this kind of swapping of genders and cross-dressing happens, and people romance each other. The women dress as men and the men dress as women, and then they romance each other, or people of the same gender romance each other. So many things happen which are like this, which of course we can understand in terms of orientation and different orientations being incorporated. But I think they also do hark back to this tradition of you become so immersed in the object of your love that you become that object, right? So I feel that you also see these older traditions play out in films in many different ways, and they hark back to the inherent recognition of queerness, of love itself, and of desire itself in our culture.
And it relates to fandom, the earlier conversation about, the uncle who sings the female part. So what the entire, I mean, the playfulness, the sometimes the excess and the irrationality of the entire genre of Bollywood allows for kinds of identifications. It's much more open to certain kinds of identifications and mixing and crossing and transgression that you don't see in film that tries to have a political message in a much more neatly packaged form.